Do you like my haircut? I just finished yesterday the Animorphs series, and by one measure, it took me 22 years, and by another, it took me 6, which is still too long, because if I had just kept reading them month to month as they were coming out, back when they first were coming out, it would have only taken me 5. Um, the reason it took me 22 years is that, well, I wasn't as good a reader back then, but also the summer before 7th grade, I was assigned to read Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. And I don't put all the blame on Little Women, but it took a lot of time and a lot of reading effort, and I let my devotion to the Animorphs series lapse. So that's why it took 22, why it took 6 instead of 5, or really it would have only taken 2 months if I just bought all the books all at once from Amazon and read them at the pace that I was reading them anyway, which is day to day. It would have taken me a couple of months, but I didn't do that. I didn't want to buy them from Amazon. I wanted to hunt them down in library sales and used bookstores, and get excited to find them instead of just taking the easy way. So I did that, and therefore they were scattered about. And I got books of varying physical quality. If it was a book that I didn't have and it was in very bad shape, it was a real struggle to decide whether or not to get it. But I finally amassed all of them. I borrowed 2 from a friend for reasons of not letting one book in between 2 books that I had get in the way of me progressing through the series. And I bought 1 from Amazon because Megamorphs 4 was all that stood in the way between me and finishing the series on this trip right now. The reason it took so long is I read only while staying at my parents' house in Rochester, which is where I am now and where I read most of the original series. So that is why it took 6 years instead of 5, and that is why it took 22 years instead of 5, and I'm glad that I was able to savor it, that I was able to have fun hunting the books down, which is a little different process than back when they first came out. I didn't understand the books came out on Tuesdays, so the first of every month I would call Barnes & Noble and Borders and ask, do you have the new Animorphs book yet? And they would say no until they got it, which sometimes was after 7 days and 7 calls. One occasion, I was in Woodstock reading book number 9 and walked into the bookstore there, and for some reason they had book number 10, which was very exciting. It was early. It was the first time I got a book before it came out, and I was very excited by it. But that's the story of, well, it's not the whole story of me and Animorphs. The whole story of me and Animorphs starts with those little scholastic flyers that they would hand out in book order forms at the beginning of each month in homeroom in elementary school. And I saw the one, let's see, right here, saw this one, and that appealed to me. And it has more versions of the morph than in future books. But that cover appealed to me. I've always been an animal lover, and I love that these books went inside the mind of animals, but mostly initially I just judged it by its cover because that was all I had. And I got hooked, and I kept buying them. At one point, I bought a box set of the first 4. That was after I had bought that one, and so when it came, I replaced the first one that was in the box set with that one. No, not that one, because that was a one that I got from a used sale recently, but with my number 1 that I had already purchased, and I kept the box set until I sold the whole series, which is why I had to reassemble the collection at a garage sale, probably around high school or college, because I was very foolish. And of course, with that, the box set went, and that was sad. I was sad, and that I knew that I could collect all the books, but I would never get that special box set back. Fortunately, the other day, I was at the Book Nook in East Rochester, and they had 2 box sets. Not the first 4 Animorphs, but 13 through 16 and 9 through 12. So I took the books that were in these boxes out of them and put them on the shelf and asked the person there if I could just buy these, and she said, "Well, okay." She was a little confused, but she sold them to me, and now I have them. I think there was another box set that came out around the time that the TV show debuted, which I once had, and haven't seen that since. I think it encompassed the first 15 or 20. Um, so that is, for the most part, the story of Animorphs, and I'll slip in more anecdotes as I talk about it. Um, I'll start with the characters. Jake, um, the kind of standard superhero, the Superman, Batman figure, the leader, the military leader with more military heritage than a lot of people. Um, his story, his character type, not and no fault of his, probably a lot of people's favorite, but not mine. That's just not what I gravitate towards. So I found his stories interesting, especially the first two, the invasion, where we meet all the aliens, where we find out what's happening, where we meet Alfangor. Number 6, the capture, where that's the first time we have a Yeerk in our head, but not the last. And even number 16, where we find out that the way the guy is existing as a controller without Kandrone rays is he's eating Yeerks. That was disturbing. I liked that. I like disturbing in science fiction. Disturbing in science fiction is good, but and again, Jake, probably a lot of people's favorite character for exactly the reasons that he was not mine. He had the earliest in as far as a reason to fight the Yeerks because he found out his brother was one of them. I would think that that would have been an equal motivation for Rachel because I cannot think of a single one of my cousins that I would not fight an alien invasion for, especially if I could turn into a bear. Which brings me to Rachel. And Rachel was the only Animorph who I worried about. I worried about all of them, but I worried about what would have come of her had she not had the war. The whole point of Rachel and her story is that the war with the Yeerks unleashed something within her that was already there and probably would have manifested itself somehow. And it's a good thing she had evil monsters to fight. Because what I wondered about her is, without this, where does she put that energy? I mean, she was a gymnast at the start of the books. I don't know if she still is by the end. She certainly isn't by the very end, but I don't know where she abandons that hobby. She knows she's probably too tall to make a career of it, but that's a place to put energy. Sports is a way to put as a place to put excess energy and maybe even aggression. But again, where would that deep within Wolverine-like aggression have gone if she hadn't had a war to fight? How would it have manifested itself? Would she have been safe from it if she had been in therapy? They all could have used a bit of therapy, and they all could have used some Jungian therapy. I think that's the one with dreams, because the dreams they had were not healthy. But Rachel, she had some interesting arcs. She and especially the one the where is it? Here. This was one of the covers that, after I stopped reading Animorphs, made me most curious because before I knew what happens in this book, I was like, what happened? What's wrong? What went wrong? Is she stuck between morphs? Is she is it an alien disease again, like that other time? I was more curious about this than the ones where they just turned into animals, or even the ones where they just turned into aliens, or if they turned into human beings. She kind of turns into Wolverine, and now I've read the book, I know that creature that she turns into is actually 20, 30 feet tall. And that was an interesting story, an interesting use of Rachel's character, as was the book number 32, where she's morphs a starfish. I can't show all the covers because they're in stacks, and I don't want to spend too much time reaching back there, but where we get to see, when she turns into a starfish and she gets cut in half, and then we get to see pure scared child Rachel and pure aggressive monster Rachel. And you can't do the Jekyll and Hyde thing with any other Animorph that effectively. Um, so that was an interesting one, and then it created one of my first frustrations with having the books. They maintained continuity, but they sometimes felt like they were written by two different people, because in the very next book, Tobias mentions that he never thought he'd see Rachel whimper, and the whole point of the book right before was there's a Rachel and she's whimpering because that's the side of Rachel that whimpers. Um, but yeah, Rachel was very interesting, and that transitions to Tobias. And Tobias was another. He wasn't like Jake in that his story was just too conventional for me to really take an interest in. I had trouble with the fact that he was a hawk and I couldn't identify with the hawk. Everything about Tobias, his story, his family, his his personality evolution when he becomes a hawk, um, how he thinks, well, maybe I wanted to become a hawk eventually. It's all interesting, but the day-to-day hawkness of him, I just couldn't get behind. The freeing of the Hork-bajir, that was one of the best parts of the series, but I couldn't identify with Tobias because he was a hawk, and it's good to have challenging stories out there. It's good to read challenging stories, be challenged by stories, and if they don't all work completely, I still found it interesting. I still, as both in itself and as a part of the greater series that I really like, but it was it was difficult to get behind him and enjoy being in his head as much as I enjoyed being in other people's heads. Um, an example of this, a good example is, and again, I'm not going to reach for it because I don't know exactly where it is, but the number 23, where they're trying to track down the human Tobias because some lawyer has a message from his father that's supposed to be delivered on a certain birthday, and he goes around as a hawk tracking his supposed relative, who turns out to be Visser 3. And for the most part, I wasn't that into that story, but then at the end, and this will come back when I talk a little bit about Visser 3, he goes into the office, he gets the message, he finds out that Alfangor is his father. He knows what it means, but he's got to pretend not to, and he's got to get angry that his father didn't leave him anything, and that this is just a useless, crazy message. And then Visser 3 comes to his defense and says something to the effect of, Alfangor was no fool. He and I disagreed, but he was no fool. He was a great and worthy opponent. It doesn't say opponent because Tobias the Kid is not supposed to know that there's an alien invasion, but that was a key moment for Tobias, and it was a key moment for Visser 3, because it was when Visser 3 said kind of what Magneto says about Charles Xavier when Charles Xavier died. The whole Charles Xavier did more for mutant kind than you will ever know. My one regret in all this is that he had to die for our dream to live, or however it goes. Same with the reverence that Voldemort and Grindelwald have for Dumbledore. One of the marks of a good villain is respect for their foil, and so that was a defining moment for Tobias and Visser 3. I will now jump to Axe. This is Axe, and this was an exciting book. I'm still getting used to things are on the opposite side on the screen. This is how Axe looks. It's the first time we see an official illustration of an Andalite, the official design of the Andalite. And also, the book is just, it pops beautifully. One of the things that I love about these books is that the covers are kind of classic pop science fiction with those off-kilter color combinations that that just scream, this is otherworldly. And this was one of my first favorite covers. But before this happened, there are plenty of descriptions of Andalites in the books, and so in an art class, I decided to make one. And I didn't always catch everything, every detail in the book. And now, obviously, when I made this, I don't know how old, but probably not old enough to have been expected to create a convincing human torso. And it's a good thing, therefore, that I didn't realize he had one, or arms, even though he is described frequently as having 7 fingers, which means hands, which means arms. I did do two stock eyes. One of them broke off. That's not my fault, but I also did 4 eyes on the face because he was always described as having 4 eyes and stock eyes, and I didn't put 2 and 4 together. Also, I created what could only be described as a not the tail blade, not a scorpion-like tail blade, but more of a like a scraper for his tail. And I think that's all. So this is what I thought an Andalite looked like before that book came out. And I have to say that the Transformers action figure is an improvement on mine, but still not, because of the nature of the Transformers toys, still not exactly uh, an Andalite, because it has to have, he's got essentially 2 tails back here. His scorpion claws, because he morphs a scorpion in the Transformers toy version, are there. So it's not a perfect Andalite either. Better than mine. Axe is the distant alien, the Spock character, he might be called, and he was a character that I kind of identified with. I sometimes feel like a distant alien. He would remain silent for much of the Animorphs meetings, and then come up with something, say it, and he developed a dry sense of humor, and so that was always something of a surprise, and they weren't sure whether or not he was deliberately being funny. And that's sometimes me. I think people sometimes aren't sure whether or not I'm joking about a thing. Axe, they all had repeated themes in their books, and Axe's was, to be expected, and perhaps one of the more interesting. He is a military cadet in his Andalite world, and he's a warrior on Earth among the humans. And his repeated arc is: am I an Andalite? Am I one of the humans? Is my loyalty to the Andalites? Is my loyalty to the humans? And the humans are consistent throughout. But he's always, when he meets an Andalite, he's just got the worst luck with Andalites. He meets the worst Andalites. And that's got to hurt him, because he meets the Andalites who are traitors. He meets the Andalites who want to poison the Yeerks on Earth, and by extension humans, and cause a plague and destroy it in that way. He meets he has problems with high command. He doesn't have a lot of luck with the Andalites, which is probably why he maintains his loyalty to Prince Jake. And through his stories, we learn about the Andalite rituals, and a lot about Andalite culture. When Tobias, when they realize that Tobias is actually his nephew, and Tobias morphs into him for purposes of convincing someone that his Hawk morph is a morph and not his permanent body, and Axe starts teaching Tobias the Andalite rituals. I could use a lot more of that in the series. I understand there's only so much room to do so many things, but more about Andalite culture, and more about Tobias learning to be an Andalite now that he knows that that's his heritage. That would have been very interesting to go into, but one of the many, again, limited space, and but very interesting connection. Let's see, anything more about Axe? I can go back to things. Marco was my favorite Animorph when I first read the books, because I wasn't the wit, I wasn't the class clown, but I hoped to be. That's what I ideally would have been. And also, first cover with Marco comes out. Here it is. He's got long hair, and I gravitated. I have a haircut now, but about a week ago, it was much longer, and I've always preferred to wear my hair long, and therefore I gravitated toward male characters with long hair when I was a kid, and Marco was one of them. And he is the last Animorph to really join the fight, because he's the last one to find his motivation, which is that his mom is Visser 1. And that's a and which also means he's the one Animorph out of all of them that really gets the prize at the end of the war, and not just because he takes on the mantle of the public Animorph and the celebrity, but because he goes in when he's whole hog in, it's to free his mother, and he does, and he reunites her with his father, and I knew that happened. I details about the end of the series filtered in because of the internet and other things, and I peeked every so often. I stopped buying the books and reading them, but I would look in every so often. So I knew that happened. I didn't know that his father remarried and that Marco reunited his parents at the expense of that woman's freedom, and that he knows what he's doing and he doesn't care. There are some moral ambiguities. There are tons of moral ambiguities in the series, but Marco also has some interesting one. He's part of the David trilogy, which was one of my favorite sequences of the series. I guess from this, it looks like he's the introduction to the David series, and he is it's his book When We Meet the Lyrans. It's his book when we meet the Chee, and the Chee are a great creation. So Marco has some great books. He's also got the epic book where he confronts his mother, who becomes the second Yeerk after Aftran, Cassie's friend, to learn that the Animorphs are human, and she only knows that her son is one of them. But that's an interesting development, and she keeps the secret. So that brings us to Cassie, Aftran's friend. And when I first read the books, and I bought that 4-pack, and I had read the first 3 books. Well, actually, no, I bought the 4-pack. I think I'd only probably read 1 or 2, but I see the cover, and I find out that Cassie is black, and it says in the early books that she is black, but I was not a great reader. I didn't pick up on everything, just like the Andalite's arms. I didn't pick up on the fact that she was described as having dark skin, and it didn't bother me. I didn't react negatively to it. I just kept reading. But a couple years ago, when the Hunger Games movie came out, and the young people who had been the target audience of Hunger Games, same demographic as had been the target audience of Animorphs, went on the internet and social media and expressed various levels of disappointment, shall we say, that Rue, the character Rue, is black, and she's described as black in the book. But young readers don't always pick up on everything, and they shouldn't have responded angrily, and they shouldn't have said things like, it makes her death less sad. But when that happened, I thought, that if social media had been around, that could have been me, not saying the angry stuff, but just the expressing surprise, oh, this character's black. So I kind of, it's a cultural problem that a reader like me, like some of those readers, just naturally whitewashes all of the characters in a given story when they can't see them. And it's a problem we can fix as a culture, not scolding individual children for making that mistake. But as I'm rereading the Animorphs books these past 6 years and seeing what a great character Cassie is, and also hearing about efforts to increase representation in movies, especially superhero movies, I thought, I hope that, I don't know exactly what the demographics reading Animorphs were, but I hope that back at a time when there weren't a lot of black teenage female superheroes, that some little black girls knew that they had this great figure in Cassie, a powerful, passionate, brilliant superhero that looked like them. And this time through, she became my favorite character because she really is the rock that holds things together. Jake is the appointed leader. He makes the decisions, but she's Jake's love interest, Rachel's best friend, and the one with the emotional maturity to comfort Marco and Tobias in their pain. She is also the Animorph that Axe has, the only human that Axe has any reason to show express any admiration for, because she's the best morpher, as she demonstrates right in the first book when she pays tribute to the Andalite when she's demorphing from a horse into, I think, either blue spandex or her overalls. I don't remember exactly what it was. Um, she also has, I think the writers, both K.A. Applegate and now Catherine Applegate, and her ghostwriters knew that Cassie was a special one because they seem to have given her the most solo projects. Like in the sickness here, um, I don't know if it's the first time we see a Yerk illustration, but um, Cassie, it's kind of a game of uh, elimination. The Animorphs get sick one by one. They get very sick. She's the only one who doesn't, at least not until she can save the day. And she's the perfect one to save the day because she's raised by doctors, animal doctors, but still. Um, and she has some of the skills necessary to perform brain surgery on an alien. None of the other Animorphs could have done anything like that. Also, one of her last books, one of the last books, the writers just ship her off to Australia, and she has a solo adventure in Australia. And I just thought that was funny and fun, and I got to, she wakes up in the cargo hold, and she builds herself a nest, and she plans things out, and she escapes the plane, and in midair, and she's good enough at her job as an Animorph to do that, and not all the Animorphs were that graceful. And here's another Cassie cover that, again, I love the covers. I love the way they pop, the way, like, this has kind of a rainbow thing going on. Goes nicely with her pink. The metallic print is pink. I'm going to show a couple of covers just from their beauty. Yeah, so Cassie was my favorite this time around. The one I would have wanted to raise if I was going to raise a daughter. I'd want it to be Cassie. I'd probably end up with Rachel, but I'd want it to be Cassie. There's even a line in the 14th book where her parents, I forget exactly what it is, but they essentially say, yeah, she's all right. She's doing all right. And I'm thinking the other Animorphs, they're all tortured, and Cassie's the one, she's the stable one. And I like that in a hero. All right, so this is Visser 3. The Transformer Visser 3, he turns into the monster that eats Alfangor. Visser 3 is the monster that eats Alfangor. He turns into a creature with a mouth and that is big enough to eat Alfangor, which I'll maybe try to do while I'm talking. No, I won't. And then a few more action figures that I have. This is Rachel. I forget how to show you her face, but it is, I promise it's Rachel, because she's the one who turns into a lion in the, I'm not even going to try. She's the one who turns into a lion in the TV show, which was a disappointment to me because bears are my favorite characters, and Rachel's, when she goes to acquire the bear in the 7th book, is one of her first acts of recklessness, and she, and it's a bear, and I love bears. This is Tobias. This is how I always preferred to have my Tobias, with a kind of half hawk, half human, which is what Tobias is. But he also turns into the most complete animal, realistic-looking animal, and kind of the most realistic-looking human. If I get rid of the claws here and the wings, hold up the wings. So that's the end of my action figures. I have a couple more props. I have the demo CD-ROM. I think it came with, for some reason, I'm thinking book number 26. I'm not sure, but I'd take it and try to play it, but the disc is broken, unfortunately, so I can't do that. I may yet try my hand at this, which I never really got into either of these video games. But I had them because I had the systems. Well, that one I had because I bought one of the books. This one I had a Game Boy. I tried. I didn't get it. Apparently, I wasn't the only one. So those are the video games. I've talked about each of the Animorphs in Visser 3. Great secondary characters as well. Marco's mom / Visser 1, very complicated character, very complicated arc. She's more Visser 3's enemy than the Animorphs' enemy. Perhaps the best character that was in the least amount of books is Toby, the first Hork-bajir born into freedom, who we get to see grow up, and she's a seer, so she can communicate uh, more easily with the Animorphs, and she can be a leader of her people. Um, the, uh, the free Hork-bajir represent freed slaves as a general idea, and it was a little weird in whichever book it was where that was half Jake's narration and half his Civil War ancestors' narration to directly parallel the free Hork-bajir, who are genetically engineered to have inferior intelligence and be physically imposing, with the escaped slaves during the Civil War, um, since the stereotypes of being physically imposing and intellectually inferior are stereotypes that have kept black people down since slavery, since before slavery, and since slavery ended. So that was a little weird to parallel them. Um, let's see. But, and again, Jake's military heritage, not my favorite part of the series. Somebody else's favorite part, probably. I can think of a public figure who probably Jake would be their favorite for that very reason. The prequels, the Chronicles, Andalite, Hork-bajir, Visser, and I don't have Ellimist with me, but that's okay. Ellimist was not my favorite. And the reason it wasn't, unlike those three books, the Ellimist doesn't tell a story that, to me anyway, directly ties to the rest of the rest of the books. Those prequels, they're not what the Animorphs' lives were like. They're not even what Axe's life was like before the action of the regular series. They go back and they deal with characters that we don't know a ton about, but they tell stories that detail the Yeerk invasion and how it progressed. To an extent, they are an origin story for Visser 1, but he's more of a background character than Aldrea, Alfangor, and the Hork-bajir. And so, reading the Hork-bajir Chronicles and the Andalite Chronicles, this time around I read them chronologically. I didn't read them in the order that they came out. I read them in the order that they tell the story. Because I already knew the backstories, there was no reason for me to wait. But also, those were the two I had. These two books I did not buy. I borrowed them from a friend more than 10 years ago. And if you're watching, you probably know who you are. And, if we're ever in Rochester at the same time, I'm happy to give them back if you want them. I still have them, and they're yours if you want them back. But I was just looking for something to read over the course of a couple of days, and I thought, oh, well, the Animorphs books, the Animorphs Chronicles. They were the only two I had at the time. I read them, and I already had a blog, and I'd written a few blog posts, but they got me blogging because I thought, I have a lot to say about this. Katniss Everdeen was the big deal at the time from the Hunger Games, but I thought, the Hork-bajir Chronicles, the main character is a strong female. This was when strong female characters, the whole people started to think we have to make a concerted effort to have more strong female characters. And I was thinking, well, Aldrea was there. Why not make a movie about Aldrea? Which, of course, got me to really think about making the movie of the Animorphs. And I actually said to K.A. Applegate, I met her, Catherine, she goes by Catherine now. I met her at the Brooklyn Book Festival, and I asked her about the movies, and she said, if they ever make a movie, she'd be the last to know. And I said, well, if I ever make a movie, then you'll be the first to know. And I started, I think that night, writing an adaptation of the Andalite Chronicles. And I also finished that night. Not finished the script, I just stopped doing it. But as I've read the books, and on all respect to the Nickelodeon adaptation, which I've got more appreciation for as time has gone on, especially as I've seen old Doctor Who's and old Star Treks. That's pretty much the level of special effects, and there's a lot of charm, and there's a lot of I don't know what the word is, but it's not nothing. I liked the Hork-bajir puppets. I liked the real animals, and how you never really saw the Animorphs attacked when they were in morph, because you can't show someone attacking a real animal. You just saw, presumably, the animal trainers as Yeerks getting taken down by the tigers and the wolves and the lion. Here's my pitch for the Netflix show. There are many reasons to do an Animorphs adaptation on Netflix or streaming service. It doesn't matter which, um, but and it extends to more than it's part Harry Potter, part Hunger Games, part Game of Thrones, part every popular YA and fantasy and science fiction. A lot of the stories draw inspiration from classic science fiction, whether Fantastic Voyage or The Lost World or um, Doctor Who, um, Star Trek. Area 51 isn't so much a classic science fiction story as an urban myth, but there's an Area 51 Animorphs, and a lot of the titles of my blog posts are based on whatever science fiction property they came from. But so there are those reasons, but mostly we have the technology now, and by that I mean we have the morphing technology, motion capture, and photorealistic computer-generated images are morphing technology, right down to the spandex suit that the motion capture actor wears for the purposes of superimposing an image over the performance. Picture, if you will, Andy Serkis, let's say. He seems like a good example. Andy Serkis, wearing a suit in human form, has just said something threatening as Visser 3, and then he morphs into the Andalite Visser 3. And but it's still, the camera never leaves him. It's still his eyes. It's still his, I mean, he doesn't have a mouth or a real nose, but it's still his movements of his head and his shoulders and his hands. And then he morphs into a monster. And again, camera doesn't have to leave him, and it can still be his eyes and his movements to an extent. Obviously, battle sequences wouldn't necessarily feature the actors, but in the case of, say, Marco in Gorilla Morph, the actor would be wearing a motion capture suit and facial capture technology, whatever it is. And so there are passages in the books where it says the gorilla grinned or the tiger grinned, and that could be the actor grinning, just like in the new Jungle Book or presumably the new Lion King movies. So that's the main reason. There are the battle sequences are cool. The aliens are amazing. I think that Andalites and Hork-bajir are some of the most physically beautiful and interesting aliens created in all of science fiction. And Taxons even as well. Taxons got their, where's the Taxon? They got their attention late. They were the ones who remained monsters for the longest out of all of the aliens, and they were not featured in that Aliens of Animorphs poster that had the Helmicrons and the Strychna and the Venmer. For some reason, the Taxons were left out, one of the 4 most important alien groups in the series, and they were left out. But even they have their, when Tobias and Axe morph them, we find out there's more to them. Well, there's not actually a lot more to them than their hunger. But the hunger possesses them. It makes them incapable of anything else. It controls them. And find out in that book exactly what it's like in their heads. And then in later books, we find out they want out. The only reason they allied themselves with the Yeerks was the Yeerks would feed the hunger. Well, now they know there's another way. They can morph. But they're not being allowed to morph because they are the Yeerks' primary workers. So that's interesting. Even the Taxons eventually got their due, and the Yeerks got their due with the Yeerk resistance movement, with Aftran making friends with Cassie, and Cassie, that book's somewhere around here. Cassie, and this has the interesting detail of when Cassie, as a caterpillar, goes through the natural metamorphosis process, she then can demorph, and that's an interesting thing. But Aftran, that's when we learn that the Yeerks aren't just malicious, they are scared and they are envious, and that's why that runs them. And eventually someone like Visitor 3 comes along who that's ingrained in, and he's a genuine psychopath. But for the most part, the Yeerks, they just want to be able to see and smell and sense now that they know that that's an option. And so even before I got toward the end of the books, where morphing became a way out for the Yeerks of the war, I thought, if Prince Zero had just given them the morphing technology instead of spaceflight, we could have avoided a lot of grief. But then there would be no Animorphs series, and I really like the Animorphs series. I did want to mention the ghostwriters, and also Michael Grant, Catherine Applegate's husband, who helped write the stories. I don't know to what extent, but Jeffrey Zilke, I don't know how any of these names are pronounced. I'm just reading them. Laura Batiani Weiss, Amy Garvey, Melinda Metz, Elise Donner, Ellen Giroux, Erica Babon, Elise Smith, Kimberly Morris, Gina Gascon, Emily Costello, Lisa Hardraker. Apologies if I missed a ghostwriter, but I want to congratulate the ghostwriters because I was worried. I have a weird thing about a franchise story being carried on by anyone other than the creator. I was worried when I got to the ghost-written books, which is most of the second half of the series, that it would bother me, and it never did. I never felt like I wasn't reading an Animorphs book by K.A. Applegate. I keep saying K.A. Applegate because that's the name on the front of the books, but I know she goes by Catherine now. But you know, it was a relief. I didn't like all of the Animorphs books, but I also didn't necessarily like all of them that were written by her. So it was more about the story, the characters, how it played out, than it was about who was actually writing it. And in my blog posts, I tried to give credit where it was due to the ghostwriters. Few last things. Oh, this is upside down. This is fun. Marco. I started to suspect around book 12 that he might not be entirely straight. And I went to the internet and I was informed that Michael Grant had apparently confirmed on Twitter Marco was supposed to be bisexual. And naturally, in the late 90s, he was in the closet, as any 13-year-old to 16-year-old kid would be. In the Netflix adaptation or whatever streaming service adaptation, Marco would be, what's the word? Explicitly queer. And he doesn't, he's the only Animorph that doesn't pair up, other than Axe. I guess Axe doesn't pair up, but Axe talks about having had crushes on female Andalites. But he's a huge flirt. He flirts with everybody. Poor Rachel takes the brunt of his flirting. This would just mean, as depicted, he would flirt with guys as well as girls. And that would, it would just be part of the series. It wouldn't change a thing. But mostly, I just want to emphasize that this can work. There's a lot of great sequences that would have people watching at home cheering for the Animorphs. I think a typical Animorphs episode would be 45 minutes, maybe to an hour. Hork-bajir Chronicles or any of the Chronicles or the Megamorphs would be maybe 90 minutes to 2 hours. There'd be a lot of learning about animals and what it's like to be animals, and how hard it is to control certain morphs, and a lot of great creature design, especially with Visser 3's attack morphs. Great opportunities for all different kinds of actors to like the Chi and their holograms. All different kinds of actors would populate this series. Maybe 4 seasons of 15 episodes each. The bigger episodes could be special events. I don't know. I would hope to be involved in some level, but mostly I think it would just be a great thing for people to see and experience. Or they could just read the books. It's not hard to get them in bulk on Amazon, but it's a lot more fun to track them down. All right, let's see. I've been going for almost 45 minutes. I think this has been coherent, and I think I've said all that I wanted to say. So I'm going to leave off with, just like Animorphs gave my blog somewhere to go, it became a blog about books that I'm reading because I thought I have something to say. I want to say about the Hork-bajir and Andalite Chronicles, and I'm going to say it on my blog, and it became a book blog for the most part, and that led to other things. I'm hoping, I don't know exactly what I would do with YouTube, but I'm hoping that having done this to whatever level of success I have, I now feel like I can do more. I don't know that I would do movie reactions, trailer reactions, although for good measure, let me just list a couple of movies that I unabashedly love. Star Wars' The Phantom Menace and The Last Jedi, the 1998 Godzilla, Jurassic Park 3, Love Actually, and The Fantastic Beasts: The Crimes of Grindelwald. Okay, I don't love The Crimes of Grindelwald yet, but I like it a lot, and she's got 3 movies to make it make sense, so I'm going to give her that time, and then I will reserve final judgment. But those are, I think, what are called hot takes on certain movies. It doesn't mean I don't love the good ones from those franchises and elsewhere. It just means I have a special place in my heart for movies that are not necessarily universally well regarded. I don't know if I'll talk more about books or more about Animorphs at all. This is another cover that I think just pops beautifully. Always clouds in the background, and just differently colored, differently arranged clouds. Oh, I should mention, I mentioned all the ghostwriters. The person responsible for the cover illustration, David B. Mattingly, his work. I don't know that he did all of the everything, but he did the morphing, he did the covers, and the covers are amazing. And so David Mattingly. Any other end credits that I should hear about? And again, I occasionally rewatch the Nickelodeon version. One of the late books has a little dig at Nickelodeon, and I looked at the timing, and it seems to have come out 6 months after the show went off the air on Nickelodeon. One of the books says something to the effect of when a princess character turns into an animal and they do it gracefully and it looks nice. That's not how morphing is. Disney doesn't know morphing. Neither does Nickelodeon. And I thought that was amusing. There's some stuff like that too in these books. They're well crafted. Editing got a little sloppy toward the end. Characters that were not in morph would be using thought speak, and characters that were in morph or Andalites would be speaking with quotation marks. And I blame the editors, not the writers, on that. This is a nice cover, the last cover. I peaked when this book came out, and I figured out which one dies. Although the math, it began with 6 and it will end with 5, doesn't quite line up. It actually began with 5, unless you count Alfangor, which you shouldn't. And then Axe made 6 in the 4th book, at the end of the 4th book, and then it doesn't really end with 5, because at the very end of the book, there are only 3 of the original Animorphs, plus an Andalite, and 2 humans. So that's 6, and if you count the still living Animorphs that aren't part of the mission, Axe and Cassie, then that's 8, but it's fine. All right, I'm going to bring this to an end, and thank you for watching if you watched. It's longer than I thought it would be, but it's an experiment, and who knows what it will lead to, if anything. I hope that my thoughts on Animorphs that I've spoken are of interest to anyone else who's interested in Animorphs. I hope that, yeah. All right, so let me just ram the blade chip.